Good evening, and welcome to the Race and Justice and World Affairs series with WorldDenver. My name is John Krieger. I'm the Executive Director of WorldDenver. We're a nonprofit membership organization that facilitates international exchange and global engagement. We bring about 600 international visitors to Denver every year to exchange ideas and expertise from around the world. And while the world has been shut down and in isolation, we've continued to keep those conversations up through virtual exchanges and through webinars and through global or through engagement on the virtual platforms. And we're so excited this evening to be joined in this conversation by Donna Bryson and by Dr. Everette Freeman. Donna is somebody who is a prolific and influential journalist in Denver. She's someone who I know every time I see her byline in the Denverite or hear her voice on the radio, I know that the story is going to be incredibly compelling, well-sourced, objective, and extremely well-written. What folks might not know is that Donna has also had a career as a journalist around the world, including 2 stints in South Africa. And we, as an international exchange organization, know that we have a lot to learn from our neighbors throughout the world. And when it comes to our continued pursuit of racial justice and equity in all parts of American life, we have a lot to learn from South Africa. And so we're excited to hear more from Donna this evening. We're also honored to be joined by Dr. Everette Freeman, who is the president of the Community College of Denver, and himself has unique and important perspective around race and how it impacts institutional and academic settings. So with that, I will hand things over to our speaker and to our moderator. Before I do so, I just want to remind you all that these are conversations and that we would like to invite you all to be a part of that conversation. There is a question box on the side on your control panel. You can enter your questions there throughout the conversation, and when we come back towards the end, we'll try to get to as many of those questions as we can. I one more time want to thank our moderator, our speaker, and I'll hand it over. I'm so looking forward to this presentation. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and soon to be evening. I'm Everette Freeman, as you mentioned, and it's a pleasure to spend some time with Donna Bryson. Donna, I'd like to start with a question or two. One thing that I've noticed about you and your career is that you tend to deal with issues of hospitality or welcoming. The work you do here in Denver, examining the plight of homeless, is reflective of the work that you've done through your professional career. Tell us a little bit about what this business of hospitality in Donna Bryson is all about.
Well, certainly I've traveled a lot, both within the United States. I grew up the daughter of a civil servant working for the Department of Defense, and we lived in several places across the U.S., including some time in Pueblo when my father worked for the Army Depot. Later, I left the United States the first time in 1993 to go to South Africa. I was there for the first all-race elections, a pretty exciting time until '96. And then from South Africa, I traveled with my husband to India and was South Asian news editor for the Associated Press for 3 years. And then to Cairo, where I was Middle East news editor for 6 years. And then to London, where I also acted as an editor, but an editor responsible for our Africa coverage. And then back to South Africa in 2008 to 2012. So I've been a visitor in many places. And I guess what I'm doing is paying it forward, because in all of these places, I've relied on people welcoming me, people showing me around, welcoming me into their lives. A stranger from a strange land, because the U.S. can seem very strange to people outside America. And I was thinking today about my time in the Middle East in particular. Someone was just asking me today how I was treated as an American after 9/11, living in Cairo. And I told her, and I've reflected on this quite a bit, that the importance of treating a stranger right, of being a good host, is so important in Islam and so important throughout the Middle East. And that's the first reaction that people had to me, was to welcome me, not as an American, but as a stranger who was owed hospitality. And I think I can't pay any of that back, but I can pay it forward. And I do try to in my writing and the stories I choose as my topics. And really in my life here in Denver, being a WorldDenver host.
Well, you talked about paying forward, and it seems to be the book that you've written is a meditation on paying forward in a lot of ways. It's a black and white thing. Forgiveness is not for sissies, Desmond Tutu says in his commentary about your book. What were you getting at? What was your mission? What was your aim in writing this book?
That quote from the Arch, as they would call it in South Africa, this idea that forgiveness is hard work. And often, when you've been wronged, the act of forgiveness is another, you're giving more. You've lost and you have to give more to set the balance right. And it's just remarkable to me that people are willing to take on that challenge and that burden of forgiving and of giving more. It's also remarkable to me often how little we value forgiveness. I don't think we do. We think the person who is forgiving is somehow weak. We miss the strength that it takes. Maybe because it's difficult for us to admit to guilt. And we have to admit to the gravity of the harm in order to recognize the depth of the forgiveness. And if we can't do that, then we don't recognize the importance of forgiveness. And I think I learned that in South Africa more than any other place I visited.
That's a powerful observation, and you populate your book with some incredibly powerful individuals from both South Africa and this country. I'd like you, if you would be willing to read some from your book to give our listeners a sense of what it is that you're engaged in and the conversations that you in fact had with your participants and your subjects of this book. Guest this evening is Donna Bryson, and she's talking about this marvelous book of hers. It's a black-white thing. So Donna, it'd be really delightful to hear your voice from your book.
Well, before I plunge into the book, I'm going to tell you a story about someone closer to home now, someone here in Denver. I'm a journalist. I like to tell other people's stories. Her name is Suchitra Matai. She's an artist and saw her show here in Denver. It just recently closed. She's someone who uses paint and found objects and light, history and memory to tell her stories. So what she included in this latest show here in Denver was a video. And she didn't project her images on a rectangular screen that you might be used to, like we're looking at right now. Instead, we watched the video play out on kind of a larger-than-life silhouette of two young women in what appeared to be school uniforms. And they appeared to be in conversation with one another, or maybe play. And the images Suchitra projected on them included rural landscapes that the artist had recorded out of her car window during a road trip from Denver to Minneapolis, the city where George Floyd died under a police officer's knee. Suchitra alternated those scenes with footage of marches in Minneapolis against racism and against police violence. And by alternating the pastoral and the protest, it's as if she was telling viewers, take a breath. Now get back to work, the work of changing the world. Take a breath. And now get back to work. I told Suchitra that her video took me back to a protest that I had covered here in Denver. The protest had been organized by Black student leaders from across Colorado, many of them young women. And Suchitra's show had included many images of heroic Black and brown girls. Now, the organizers of that Denver protest I saw had made a point of including moments of reflection and even celebration in their protest, which was held at the state capitol building. Poetry was read, and the crowd did a languid Cupid shuffle. There were photographs of Breonna Taylor and Elijah McClain and others arranged on the Capitol steps with candles and flowers, kind of creating its own art show. When I described this scene to Suchitra, she said, you have to mourn and celebrate and plan. And on my way home from that protest, I found myself singing Ella's song, which was written by Bernice Johnson Reagan, as you know, and inspired by the human rights activist Ella Baker. There was one line in the song that I was really hearing over and over in my head that day. The older I get, the better I know that the secret of my going on is when the reins are in the hands of the young who dare to run against the storm. Which brings me last to my book. Okay. And to the daring young people I met in South Africa and the United States while I was researching it, the black-white thing. I first encountered the story that would become my book as news. When I arrived in South Africa in 2008 for my second assignment there with the Associated Press, a lot had already been written about a racist video produced by a group of white students at the University of the Free State in the central South African town of Bloemfontein. The video makers were opposed to living with Black students in a dorm named for F.W. Race. He, back in the 19th century, was a political leader among white empire builders in Southern Africa. What would become known as the Race video, or even simply Race, would be seen around the world thanks to YouTube. I became interested in what happened after other reporters moved on from the video. In 2009, Jonathan Jansen took over as rector or president of the University of the Free State. He was the first Black educator to hold that position. Jansen delivered an inaugural address that was published in several national South African newspapers. In that speech, he forgave the students who had been expelled because of their video and the social media storm that surrounded it. Jansen said it was useless to make scapegoats of young people for a problem that society as a whole needed to confront. Jansen's speech also outlined an approach to fostering unity in a country that remains deeply divided because of apartheid. As part of Jansen's approach, he sent Free State students to study abroad. He wanted Black and white students to be together, out of their comfort zone, away from their parents' race relations. Their journeys would be a chance to have honest conversations with one another. Jansen sent his youngest students, who we would call freshmen, so they would have time when they returned to share the lessons they had learned with others on the Free State campus. It's a Black-white thing. It's about the experiences of one of those groups of students. They went to Texas A&M. Jansen was asking his students to talk honestly with one another about apartheid and about the continued impact of a system that for generations denied the majority of South Africa's population educational, political, and professional opportunities. He also wanted his students to talk about what kind of future they could build together. Now, some people who have read It's a Black-White Thing have complained that having conversations doesn't seem like much of a solution. Words are powerful. We need action as well, but solutions attempted without first coming to a common understanding of the problem will fail. Conversations, particularly truthful ones, are hard and transformative work. So I'm going to introduce you to two of the students in my book. They are among the young people whose honesty and energy gives me hope. They are Warren Chaplin, a white English-speaking South African who was studying for his PhD. He was already in Texas when the contingent from Bloemfontein arrived. Warren would act as a host to one of the Free State students, a theology student named Miaz Nortier. Miaz is white and Afrikaans-speaking, and that is very distinct from white English-speaking. Afrikaners like Miaz are descendants of the Dutch settlers who first came to South Africa in the 1600s and who in the 19th century would lose a war to English imperialists. A little introduction for those who haven't read the book. I'm going to read a little bit. Warren remembers when he was asked to join the group of hosts, many of whom were friends he had made among liberal and progressive thinkers at CANU. I went to see the hosts and warn them about the people that they would be hosting. He told me, I think the right word is sensitize them to the people that they would be bringing them into their homes. He gave the American students a warning. My whole thing was giving them a history of race, talking to them frankly about race, and about the fact that some of the students coming really think that race is fantastically funny and great. I said, you're going to have the white students come in and tell you, South Africa is going to the dogs, and I can't wait to get out. By white, Chaplin came to realize he meant Afrikaners. Chaplin is a third-generation South African of English descent. He not only went to Wits, a leading English-speaking university, but King Edward VII, an elite Johannesburg all-boys school with stately buildings and a curriculum reminiscent of an English public school. When the visitors arrived, however, Chaplin found none of the racism he'd expected from Afrikaner students. Looking back, he now concedes that his dire predictions were a manifestation of his own perception of the University of the Free State and his own prejudices that he had to acknowledge and, as he puts it, had to own. Experience revealed his own demons. He says, I'm trying to navigate everyone else's space, but I'm not navigating my own too well. That was an interesting journey, he says at this time with the visitors from home. Then, as if underlining his words, he repeats them slowly. That was an interesting journey. During the visit, Chaplin was there with Mias Nortier, a young Afrikaner studying to be a church minister. Chaplin, who prides himself on speaking several of South Africa's official languages, found that his Afrikaans was not up to the task of communicating in Nortier's first language. He made do with English and a smattering of Sotho, one of the languages of the Black communities in the Bloemfontein area. Before his trip to the U.S., Nortier had never been out of South Africa, except to visit a game park in neighboring Botswana. And the landscape in Botswana, he says, was so much like what he was used to at home that he barely noticed he crossed the border. Texas may also have looked a lot like home. However, Nortier, who wears the universal student uniform of jeans and a t-shirt along with a mod, slightly tinted pair of glasses, and a spiky boy band haircut, found a lot to shake him during his weeks at TAMU. At first, he was shocked to find the university had no theology school, and intrigued by American secular outlook. His university traces its history to a theological institution, and has only recently begun to tone down official references to Christianity, as it tries to welcome students and staff of other faiths. The Free State model used to be "En Deo sapientia lux," and God is the light of wisdom. It is now "In veritatis sapientia lux," and truth is the light of wisdom. Nortier quotes Jonathan Jansen as saying that the university mustn't be a church. I agree in certain ways, Nortier says, and although it can be hard to process all the changes, you cannot be too narrow-minded these days. Nortier grew up in small town Bloemfontein, just 100 kilometers from Bloemfontein. After high school, he went to study to be a chef at a college in George, where English is more commonly spoken than Afrikaans. Until then, all his education had been at Afrikaans-only schools. So he had to work on his English and learn how to get along with non-Afrikaners, both at chef school and during his first job in a hotel kitchen. He says in the rural areas and the small towns, they don't love English. He traces the hostility to the language to memories and tales from when the Afrikaners were defeated by British imperial forces. There's this whole stigma about English because they saw the British people as threats way back then because of the Anglo-Boer War, Nortier says. He says there's a whole misconception about English as a language. Nortier worked as a chef for just 6 months. He found the work too hard, he jokes. Spurred on by a desire to serve the community in some way, which he still struggles to articulate, he decided to return to college to train to be a teacher. Weeks before the class was started, he learned that his hometown church would offer him a scholarship if he studied theology. He took this as a spiritual sign and switched career paths. Nortier had grown up in a religious family, he says, but until then he had never considered becoming a preacher, and he had distanced himself from what many saw as a church of apartheid. A sense that the church, too, is now trying to change was one of the things that drew him to study theology. He is studying at a university that is evolving, preparing to devote himself to a new type of church and a new South Africa. Nortier described the continuing debate over the Belfast Confession, which was written in the 1980s by leaders of the churches especially established for Black, Indian, and colored South Africans within the Dutch Reformed family. The Dutch Reformed Church, a white institution, denounced the document, which rejects segregation, claiming it had a political rather than a religious agenda. Today, it is still a point of contention within the church. The Belfast Confession was first adopted as an article of faith by increasingly assertive Dutch Reformed member churches whose congregations were not Afrikaner, and who are part of the Uniting Reformed Church in South Africa, which was reformed the year apartheid ended by the merger of Dutch Reformed mixed race and Black congregations. Slowly and fitfully, Afrikaners within the still separate Dutch Reformed Church in South Africa are embracing Belfast, as they have embraced the end of a segregated church. According to Nortier, leaders of his church are trying very hard to change now. The teachers tell us that we have to try to change. I see it as a challenge for our generation. When he visits his church at home in Bloemfontein, Nortier finds a preacher in traditional Black robes, and there is only an organ to accompany the hymns. The church Nortier attends more regularly in Bloemfontein, however, has a full band, the light rock sensibility. The Bloemfontein preacher wears jeans and a t-shirt. You can see they're almost completely different worlds, even though they're only 100 kilometers apart, Nortier said. Nortier ended up traveling across an ocean to another country to find that some of the answers he was seeking were to be found back home. Americans, he said, are actually struggling more than us. There, the white people are the majority. They can just ignore the others if they want. We can't. What he observed in the U.S. and perhaps encouraged by the example of the multilingual Chaplin, led Norte to take up Tutu, the home language of many of his classmates at UFF. Started studying the language once he returned to his own campus after his trip to Texas. Norte says that before visiting Texas, when he strolled across campus, he often used to greet only fellow white South Africans. Many Black students are from cultures where the exchange of greetings is a crucial courtesy. A literal translation of the Zulu hello is, I see you, an acknowledgement of shared humanness. The Black students who Norte failed to greet may have felt he was displaying rudeness or lack of understanding or displaying racism. But Norte says he simply feared that his Afrikaans greetings would have been read as an attempt to impose his language. He was uncertain of his English, and even more uncertain that fellow South Africans who were Black would want to engage with an Afrikaans speaker. Now, he's testing his Tutu hellos and how are yous on Black students. His class load is heavy, with Greek and Hebrew required languages for theology, not Tutu. On some days he thinks, why am I doing this? I don't have time. Then Norte remembers why he applied to go to Texas in the first place. Nothing else for which he had little time. It wasn't just a chance to go to America. He says, we're 20 years after apartheid, but sometimes it doesn't seem like that. I wanted to make my change. Since returning from Texas, Norte has become convinced that his university should abandon offering classes in Afrikaans and English in favor of teaching only in English. That would bring Black and white students together on a campus that is now, practically speaking, divided in two, with Afrikaans classes for whites and English classes for Blacks. If teaching were offered only in English, it would force students across the racial divide to be with one another, Norte believes. But Norte doesn't share his theory with fellow Afrikaners. He could be fiercely protective of their language. He prefers, he says, to lead by example. South Africans are too prone to preach at each other, he says. Everyone thinks they're right. Norte describes an evening at home in Bloemfontein with his family. When the news is on and President Zuma is there, they are, not this man again. The ANC had pledged to uplift South Africa's Black people and poor majorities and take them out of the poverty and ignorance created in large part by the deliberate inequalities of apartheid. Some white South Africans fear Black South Africans will gain at their expense. Norte has heard people in his hometown complain that Afrikaners are losing ground in post-apartheid South Africa, and saying things such as how difficult it is to be a white person now. Like the Afrikaners he knew when he was growing up, Norte questions whether government affirmative action policies are being implemented fairly, and whether his generation of white South Africans are being made to pay for the mistakes of their forefathers. But he also believes that white South Africans in the past gained privilege at the cost of others, and that some action is needed to address history. Now we're no longer privileged. You have to work harder to get what you want. You must work to prove yourself, he said. As a minister, Norte might be based in Bloemfontein or some other small town like it. He says he would embrace the challenge and try to change mindsets. He has already had a profound influence on the mindset of at least one person, fellow South African Warren Chaplin. If Chaplin had been paired during the F1 program with a Black South African, he might have brushed up on his Zulu and emerged from the experience satisfied with his own liberal credentials. Instead, he got to spend time with an Afrikaner student. When he discovered that Nias Norte did not fit the stereotype of an Afrikaner, Chaplin was forced to confront the reality of his own prejudices about Afrikaners. As Norte and Chaplin jogged together one evening in Texas, future church minister from small town South Africa mentioned to the future teacher from South Africa's biggest city that he plans to have a braai or a barbecue when he returns to Bloemfontein. On the guest list will be all those who accompanied him to America. Norte had to start running for a moment to contemplate the idea that socializing across the color line is now a matter of course. It was a powerful moment for me, Chaplin says. That's when I realized the power of this thing, that we needed to take this group of young South Africans outside of South Africa, force them into one another's space, and to have the conversation that they would never otherwise have had. Chaplin said that he saw among the UFS visitors to Texas the courage to at least begin, and they helped him make a new beginning of his own. It was so good that they put me with Nias, Chaplin says. He changed my life. He really did.
Wow. Wow. Donna, thank you for reading that from your book. I was struck about a couple of things I'd like you to amplify on. the significance of language, the Afrikaan language, the struggles that many of the Black South Africans had. And you mentioned in the beginning of your book that Nelson Mandela made it a point of giving a speech both in Afrikaan and in English. So talk a bit about language and the way language both enlightened and suppressed the struggles in South Africa.
Now, when I would come back on visits to America from South Africa, I often mentioned that there were a dozen official languages in South Africa, and that I knew plenty of South Africans who spoke, all of them, or 9 of them, or a good portion of them. There tended to be more Black South Africans who had this facility with language. But even among white South Africans, there was a lot more multi-language, or embracing having multiple languages than there is here in the United States. And I think it's important to maybe understanding the country, the way people can flow in and out of different languages in one conversation. There might be a word in Afrikaans that seems perfect for the moment, and maybe in your home language in Zulu and Sotho, it's not the right word, or a word in English that's perfect to express a sentiment. So I think it denotes kind of an openness that we don't have in the U.S., but it also could create some barriers if, particularly if you're kind of afraid of losing more than you're gaining by learning another language. And that has always been a question for South Africans. How much do we gain? How much do we lose by sharing? And maybe that's really a question for us all.
Mm-hmm. And on that point, you mentioned in the book that there was this sense among many of the Black South Africans that attending UFS and other institutions, they were becoming more white. And conversely, the whites in visiting Cornell and visiting Texas A&M oftentimes were seen as losing their identity. Could you talk a little bit about that dialectic?
Yeah, in some ways it's generational. As I said, for generations, Black South Africans have been denied these opportunities, and parents were proud to send their kids off to have these opportunities at university. They also knew they were sending off to perhaps a new world. I think worried about they would come back and see their parents as lacking somehow because they were more educated and had more opportunities. Among Black South Africans, there was definitely those tensions. Among white South Africans, particularly at a place like UFS that had been built for Afrikaners, just the idea of even teaching in English seemed like giving something up. I remember speaking to one professor, Afrikaans, and she's taught in Afrikaans, but we had a conversation in English, and she said to me, sometimes I feel dumb when I'm speaking in English, which was not true at all. She didn't sound dumb when she spoke in English, but there was the sense of uncertainty of moving out of your comfort zone when you're moving out of your home language. But I think being able to move back and forth between languages, it's more important than having a comfort zone.
Thank you for that. I'd like you to say a little bit about the residence halls, because we're in a period in this country where there's a lot of animation on both sides about the Confederate monuments. And as I was reading your book and reading about the residence halls and what they meant, could you just talk a bit about that?
I think when I say residence hall or dormitory to an American audience, they're not thinking of what it's like on the campus in Bloemfontein, but those halls are more like maybe our fraternities and sororities. There, you go to the hall where your mother lived, or you go to the hall where your grandfather lived, and these residences have traditions and iconography and that are really very much part of the past, and hung on to as we talk about this group of students who made the video. They didn't want to have Black students living in their dorm, but it really meant what they didn't want to share culture, share their corner of South Africa they're holding on so tightly with people they saw as outsiders. And I don't think anyone can quite imagine being an outsider in a dorm unless you think of that dorm as being more like a fraternity. The Race Fraternity had changed its name by the time I arrived, partly to put that video behind them. But that meant that they also had to take down statues and banners and reminders of the past, and had locked them away kind of in the basement. I knew it was there, and I asked for a little tour of it while I was there. And people in the dorm were happy to show it to me. And the way they wanted to show it to me to say, this is how far we've come. We have put this behind us. and maybe they hadn't completely, but they had made a step by kind of taking down those monuments. That's what they were, taking down those monuments to make room for to build a different kind of history.
You know, I know we want to give the audience a chance to ask some questions, but I got a couple quick ones more I'd like you to answer for me. You give Jonathan Jansen a lot of space in your work, and rightly so, given the tenure that he's had. Talk a bit more about his vision when he was going through his work as vice chancellor, and then when he became a professor, and his legacy.
Yeah, Johnson has had a history of, I think he would call himself a radical in his youth, someone who really would like to throw the whites into the sea, he might have said when he was younger. As he got older, he started to see, can't throw everything away. They're not going to go anywhere. Can we live together? His first teaching assignment at an Afrikaans was at the University of Pretoria, where he was dean of the English department at one period. So he had a background in coming to these historically entrenched Afrikaner institutions and asserting himself. He was able to do that. He could both assert himself and say that there will be change without making it a fight. Because he wanted to bring as many people along with him as he could. And I was kind of fascinated by that attitude. The going from wanting to throw them into the sea to saying, can we come along together? And it made me think there was another person I interviewed for my book, a human rights lawyer in Bloemfontein, who said, when talking about Jonathan Jansen forgiving the students who had made the video, and he also invited them back onto campus to finish their degrees if they wanted to. And this human rights activist lawyer was saying, well, where else can they go? We don't have racist universities anymore, but they can't go to a racist university. And we don't want to have racist universities. So the only option is that they come back here and we figure out a way to move on together without the racism.
Last question before we give our audience a chance to ask some questions. Talk about the study abroad activities for South Africans that Jansen and others made possible, and what that did to the students themselves.
And it was making it possible, because Jansen didn't want students to have to pay for this at all. He did have to raise money, and the program has faltered since then as money becomes a bigger issue. But the students went to, I think there are 15 universities that year that I worked on the book. It wasn't just Texas A&M, it was Cornell, it was universities on the East Coast of the United States, it was universities in Japan and Europe. And everyone went away, I think, thinking that they were going off to learn from others. And I think they came back with the confidence of knowing that I can teach too. You know, there were people in Texas who told these students, you know, when I see you, interracial group of students kind of cooperating and socializing together, I don't see that in my own life here in Texas. Can you tell me how you did that? And I think they came back with a sense of pride in the possibility of what they could accomplish. And maybe that was really the secret. The journey was not the destination. It was the whole experience, and it was experience that continued afterward. Because then when they came back to campus, they were meant to create projects that would help teach others on campus. And a lot of them, they set them on to varying degrees, I suppose. Not everybody embraced this work. Some people probably did just go to America because they wanted to go to America. But I think other people took on the weight of what they understood. What Prof. Jansen is, what people call him on campus. They understood the weight of what he was asking them to do and rose to it.
Donna, thank you. The incomparable Donna Bryson. Let's give the audience an opportunity to ask you some questions, Donna. I'm sure they have some.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Prof. Freeman.
I've got a couple more anyway. John, take it away.
We do have questions, and Donna, thank you so much, and Dr. Freeman as well. And the first question we have is about racism out in the open. So it's long been taboo in the United States, open racism, but it's becoming more common and prevalent out in the open, or at least online lately in certain parts of the country. In your experience, did it seem like racism in South Africa was more casual, more out in the open? Was it, what were some of the taboos around racist behavior in South Africa?
I probably want to take that apart a little bit. I think there are a lot of Americans, Black Americans, who would say racism was never went away. Maybe what's happening is that we as a country are becoming more aware instead of just some Americans becoming aware. In South Africa, there's a different dynamic. It's the majority Black population, and you can look around and see the effects of apartheid in a way that maybe you can ignore in the United States. You can ignore the effects of racism and Jim Crow in the United States because those who are suffered from it are a minority. But in South Africa, it's everywhere you look. So I find it hard to answer that question because I just think racism is obvious and prevalent in both countries, and there hasn't really been a time when that hasn't been the case. It's just a matter of what people are willing to acknowledge.
Thank you. And the next question is, how does the current activism in South Africa, how does that compare to the Mandela approach of reconciliation?
Mandela was an activist as well. And, I think he approached reconciliation as a political manifestation. It wasn't simply about ignoring what had happened in the past, but understanding that it couldn't continue to bear way down the future, that we had to move on somehow. Sometimes I think white South Africans are too quick to take reconciliation as forgiveness. We were talking earlier about not understanding how the power of forgiveness if you don't understand the weight of the grievance. And I think sometimes South Africans, because they feel that white South Africans who might feel that they've been forgiven, don't understand what they've been forgiven for. So and I don't think that Nelson Mandela would want that to be overlooked. I think he was a radical in his own way, and sometimes the situation requires radicalism.
And the next question is about the notion of the Rainbow Nation. And did you feel that was real and authentic, or a marketing publicity stunt that did not match the situation on the ground?
Well, Bishop Tutu kind of coined that phrase, and he's not a marketing person, but he is an optimist, I suppose. And I mean, there's the practicality of it. South Africa is a multiracial nation, so it's a rainbow nation in that sense. And so there's also the aspirational aspect of it too. Is it going to be a nation that will remain multicultural, multilingual, multiracial, and can we make that work? So I don't think it's said lightly, but maybe said aspirationally.
And the next question I have is about Indigenous South Africans, and how can they, and I think that this definitely can apply to comparatively to the US too, and whether Indigenous South Africans can really have freedom without economic power. Would you say that they are still beholden if they, without having control of most of the economic resources? And like I said, I think if you could apply that to economic justice here in the US as well.
Yeah, I guess we're looking at questions of inequality and inequity. Unless everyone has the opportunity, can democracy work? That's the question there. And I don't think it can. And I think you have to pursue equity as well as equality, as well as democracy. And we're still on the road here and in South Africa. Still on that journey.
And then a question about, as a journalist, someone from the media, can you talk a little bit about the role of a journalist, both in coverage post-apartheid in South Africa, and then also your coverage of issues involving race and justice here in the US, and what role you try to strike as a journalist?
Yeah, there's a lot of talk these days, and there probably was talk in South Africa in the time about what it means to be objective, and I don't think sometimes people think it means not to care or to assume that everything is of equal weight, and it's not that at all. But I think it is to step back and try to put your own assumptions and prejudices aside while you observe, and while you try to tell others what you saw. It doesn't mean not making judgments, but the judgments have to be fair, and they have to be based on your observations and what you can pin down. I feel like I'm doing that every day, trying to see what I can pin down, trying to confront my own assumptions and challenge my own prejudices so that they don't color the story. But you have to understand them, I think, and that's what objectivity means to me. It's what I brought to my work as a foreign correspondent, where I felt I was always writing for an audience that wasn't in front of me, an audience back home. Now I feel that I'm more writing for an audience back home, and they're much more quick to call me on my mistakes, which is only makes me a better journalist.
And, a question that kind of that builds on an earlier question by Dr. Freeman. Can you compare the fraternities taking down of its statues to the movement to remove Confederate statues in the American South?
I think what I find most important about the movement, certainly in the American South, is that it's started a conversation which we needed to have, a conversation about why the statues were put up in the first place, a conversation about what can replace them, a conversation about how we tell our stories, and telling the story is not the same as putting up a statue. We put up a statue to honor an idea, and mostly more to honor an idea than to honor a person. So we need to think about what ideas we are honoring. Here in Denver, there was a lot of conversation over whether they should remove the name of Stapleton from a neighborhood. Mayor Stapleton was a member of the KKK, and I think that whole debate has given us an opportunity to talk about what the KKK did in Colorado, the trauma that it must have meant for Black Americans who had come to Colorado from the South, people who had come out of slavery to Colorado, and their children and grandchildren, they see the rise of the Klan. What does that mean? And that's the discussion that I hope people are having when they think about changing names. It's not just about changing names and bringing down statues. It's about having a conversation and coming to a real understanding of our history. It's an opportunity to do that. And I think that certainly was an opportunity to do that in South Africa.
And Dr. Freeman, I don't want to put you on the spot here, but if you could weigh in a little bit on the same question, and also your reflections, having read Donna's book, to your own experience in academic institutions throughout the US, including in the American South.
One of the things that struck me about Donna's book in particular was her making a point that the administrators at the institution stayed for relatively long periods of time until that moment when the institutions were changing. And then the periods of time they stayed as vice chancellors were very short. And I think it was Fourier who left completely exhausted. And so I identify and can understand how it is that an administrator, be he Black, be he white, woman, transgender, whatever the designation, a person seeking to change an educational institution is instantly fronted with the dialectic between continuity and change, the pacing of those changes, how those changes have to inform both the past and the future after that change has occurred. And I am thrilled that the Black Lives Matter movement has taken shape. My hope is that it reflects upon some of the insights that Donna has in her book about what is possible, what the lessons that are learned from a movement. And it strikes me in a very powerful way as I was reading Donna's book that it mirrors some of what I went through as a president of a historical Black college in Albany, Georgia, where Martin Luther King came to Albany, Georgia 50 years before I was president and was engaged in a magnificent struggle there called the Albany Movement, which was the first mass movement of its time. And like the presidents of our South African universities, those students paid a price, and many of them died without ever having been, they were removed, the students who were involved in the protest were thrown out of the institution, and many of them lived their entire lives until without ever having made a reconciliation with their institution. I was lucky in that I was president at the time and had the opportunity to create that reconciliation moment. And the moment, and there's a poster right behind my back there signed by many of those participants. What that moment did is it gave me the opportunity, as Donna had, to listen, to hear the stories and to hear the stories unfiltered by my lens, but the stories that those who participated in those magnificent and courageous acts had to say, not only for the students of Albany State 50 years later when we recognize them, but for students in the future. So I would encourage Donna's book to be reading at colleges and universities in this country, precisely because it offers the moment where people can pause and ask, what does this mean for me? So Donna, congratulations on your book.
Thank you. And I think back to just getting a sense of how exhausting it is to try to create change and to listen. You know, I go back to my earlier remark that you also have to have an opportunity to rest when you're doing that. You have to understand that what you're doing is hard, and you have to be able to rest and celebrate what victories that have come along the way. Don't forget to do that, and plan for the next step.
Donna, I do want to ask a question that the audience member asked, and I asked in another way earlier. The rights video, would you really give people a sense of what that was? Because it is something that in our time we have seen shades of as well. So could you just talk about what was in it, what the intent was?
Okay. Of course, the dorm was for white students. That's who lived there. But the people who cooked for them and who cleaned for them and who kept the grounds for them were Black South Africans. What these students did was kind of create a competition in which they had the Black staff running races and carrying weights and basically humiliating them. That was the kind of the subtext of this video, including a moment where they were asked to eat something that had been adulterated and urinated in. I think it was probably they actually urinated in the food, but they gave that impression that that's what they did, and then they gave the food to the Black staff members. So it's brutal to watch, but I think partly why it's so brutal to watch is that it was so casually done, and done with what was purported to be humor. But you can see the violence of the humor as well. And I think it's probably still floating around on YouTube.
Yeah, I might have to take a look and see if I can find it. As a community college president, I am obliged to ask one question. I note that many of the Black students who attended the Africana universities were older. Could you say a word about that? Because many of these students who come to my institution are older. What strengths did they bring as they entered those institutions?
Well, certainly determination, because for a lot of these students, their education has been interrupted by having to work, by having to repeat grades because of the poor initial instruction they've been given. So to get ready to be at university, they had to repeat coursework, but they had persevered. Talk about tiring. They had, with their determination and when Mias talks about not having time for things, I think a lot of the Black students felt the same way. Do I have time to also be an activist? Do I have time to try to educate white students about my experience? And they would come around, I think, to a sense of whether I have time or not, I have this responsibility. So I think the Black students carried so much responsibility and did it with such grace. Very inspiring to watch.
You also mentioned once in the book that for South Africans who went to the universities became, in a sense, as alums, members of an exclusive club, and that they were able to get jobs in the administration, the apartheid administration in South Africa, and that created I forget the term you used. I think you used something. a term of mediocrity. It created a group of mediocre leaders. What are you thinking in? Because you also mentioned there is something about the current post-Mandela leadership. And I know someone asked the question before. Have we gained or lost an opportunity after Mandela was president in South Africa? And explain what we've gained and what we may have lost.
I think in South Africa, they gained an opportunity to keep trying. You know, so often a leader after, what apartheid was not democratic, and it was corrupt in so many ways. That's the only kind of government that South Africans, black and white, knew, was this flawed government of apartheid. So whatever was going to come next was going to be rooted to that to some extent, trying to respond to it, but also finding it difficult to get away from it. But Mandela led for one term, and when I came back to South Africa in 2008, he was the Mandela, the equivalent of a presidential library. Mandela's foundation was switching from branding that featured his face to branding that featured his hands, and the idea that this is in your hands now, which is what democracy is all about. Whether you fail or falter, or you keep trying, and it's what autocracy is the opposite of it. You don't get the opportunity to try again, to make mistakes and try again. So what South Africa has is this opportunity, which is all we all have. And I think that they need to every once in a while pause and congratulate themselves on doing that, and then see what's next.
Yeah, Donna, I've been to South Africa, and one of the things I most enjoyed when I was there was the sense of the majorityism that I experienced for being thoroughly around people of color, being thoroughly meshed in a culture that was refreshing. And seeing I literally saw a guy, Donna, who looked like my brother. And I literally had to go back to stop him, to hear him talk, to make sure it was not my brother. And what he said to me is that all of you in America have brothers and sisters here. And that was such a powerful statement. And it gets to a point that you made at the end of your book, where you talked about what you learned from this journey of writing this book. And you mentioned that you learned to be more fully human. Tell us what that means and why you ended your book by that observation.
I think a lot of it, what it meant for me was learning to be humble. It was humbling to learn stories that people were willing to share. Humbling that they were willing to share them with me. And I think it was, when Mia talks about everyone thinks they know everything. It's very hard to make change if you're not willing to be humble and willing to understand that other people might know more than you about this. And even the South Africans know more about being South African than I do, and they allowed me to listen in, and that was the listening that made me more human.
The social scientist in me also wanted to ask, you could have easily written this book with heavy laden statistics and demographic data. What made you take this approach rather than to write a socioeconomic or a book that had an abundance of graphs and charts and data that spoke to disparities? Why this approach?
I wanted readers to have the experience I had, as I say, of people welcoming me and telling me their stories. Like that's what I wanted to be at the center of it. I wanted readers to feel like they were sitting in Race talking to these young students, or they were sitting with some of the older professors who had helped make change in Bloomington without even necessarily being acknowledged, and just to feel the welcome and maybe find an understanding that way, a human understanding.
Yeah. I mean this in a very constructive way, but I also was struck by the fact that when you were talking about Jansen, you mentioned that you stalked him. And you tell people what you mean. I think I know what you mean by that, but tell people in the most positive way why you use that term and what he did for you and your thinking as you spent time with him.
But a lot of the time I spent with him was not just talking to him, it was just kind of shadowing him might be a better way to put it, but and watching his interactions on campus. And I just found that fascinating. He didn't necessarily have to feel welcome on that campus. And there were certainly white professors who probably thought he didn't belong there. But he knew he belonged there. And he knew that, and I think he wanted every student to feel that way, black and white students. And to watch him do that, just with kind of a natural ease, a natural maybe love of people. And he could only do that by watching him, not by talking to him. It's not so much what he had to say, but the way he treated other people. I was hoping to get across too. And to understand that, I did have to just kind of observe him. And he was willing to let me do that.
When COVID is behind us, do you anticipate returning to South Africa?
Oh yeah, because I have lots of friends there. I anticipate returning mostly to see people and to keep listening and to rest. I suppose I don't see it as a place I would work again, but I definitely see it as a place that I enjoy visiting and enjoy knowing that opportunity to know people there and to still feel that they are friends. It's been pretty wonderful.
Folks, I do want to make one final parallel. Many of you are reading Ibrahim Kandi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. This book is the precursor to that. I find in this book all of the gems, Donna, all of the insights that Kandi provides in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. So if you decide, folks, to read that book, invite people to read this book as well. I know you've enjoyed it as much as I have. Donna, thanks a zillion for giving me the chance to spend a little time with